Hi all. I am very grateful to my listeners who adored my metaphoric videos, which I will start making soon, after being released from my professional affiliations. Moreover, I am thankful to viewers who help me with constructive criticism, in order to improve my work and add more minutiae to my work. Hopefully you guys will like my today's story. Before proceeding, it is requested that please subscribe my YouTube channel, and press the bell icon so that you can be notified of my latest videos, which I will be uploading, with my sincere efforts. Let's come to today's story. Sher Khan and the Bettamugalam man-eater. Many years ago, a retired British administrator, popularly known as the Collector, in those days, had acquired for himself 300 acres of jungle land, on the northern slopes of the Gutharayan range of hills, in the district of Salem, where he built an incredible bungalow. He built it all of stone and to the pattern of a castle. This man loved the jungle, and he preserved it at a tremendous expense to himself, by engaging an army of coolies, to hack away the thorny undergrowth and the lantana plants, which in those years, were just beginning to envelop the forests of southern India. Since then, the lantana has grown apace, and now covers thousands of acres of reserved forest land. Various government departments, including the Forest Department, have tried and are trying in vain to eradicate this scourge. Spraying with a poisonous solution can obviously be done only on a very limited scale. A white bug has been found, which multiplies in millions. It covers the lantana bushes, blackens the stem, branches, or leaves, and kills all the lantana in perhaps an acre or two of land. Then something happens to the bugs themselves. They die within a few days, from some poison absorbed from the lantana itself, which thus gains the ultimate victory. Jungle fires rage periodically, particularly during the hot weather. The lantana was burnt to the ground, only to spring up again and flourish with the coming of the rains, fertilized by its own ashes. Incidentally, the juice from a few freshly crushed leaves of this plant, rubbed upon a scratch or an abrasion on the skin, will assist the wound to heal completely. It is as effective as tincture of iodine, with the added advantage that it does not irritate. But, to return to the British Collector and his 300 acres, he called his place Bettamugalam Estate, after the name given to the local sub-taluk area, and his stone house he called Jangali Castle. Cleaned of the strangling lantana, the natural forest grew apace. The grass that flourished in the glades between the trees attracted bison and deer, which in their turn brought their natural foes, tigers, panthers, and the still more voracious wild dogs. Conditions then began to change. The British Collector died and Bettamugalam Estate, with Jangali Castle, was bought by an Anglo-Indian, who did not have the means to keep the place up to the standard of the former owner. Once more, the lantana started to encroach upon the grassy glades, and as a consequence the bison and deer decreased in numbers. But the carnivores remained and they grew hungry. Then the Anglo-Indian died in his turn, and no legal owner came forward. Jangali Castle fell into disrepair. Villagers came on moonlit nights in bullock carts, and stole the cut granite blocks, pulling down the walls to get them. For these stones, especially when they could be obtained free, offered first-class material with which to construct the walls of their own huts. The bison had by this time vanished, and the herds or deer had almost disappeared. The tigers, panthers and wild dogs that congregated to eat the deer followed them. Only the jungle fowl, spurfowl and peafowl remained to increase in numbers. For the heavy undergrowth of lantana gave ideal cover. Otherwise, the whole area assumed a forlorn appearance. Now and again, an odd tiger or panther would pass that way, hoping but generally in vain, for a stray spotted deer or jungle sheep to break his fast. He was generally very hungry, but there was nothing to be got. Now in the village of Io, a little over 4 miles away, lived a man of about 25 years, whose name was Grappa. Grappa had married very late in life, for one of his caste and status, the usual age being around 17 to 18 years for a boy, and 13 to 14 years for a girl. But Grappa's father could not get his son married earlier, for they were a poor family, and the parents of every prospective bride turned down the marriage of the daughter to a mere yokel, the son moreover of such a poor father. But a girl was found at last. I was told that she was very deaf, and had walked with a limp from birth. Very likely, these impediments had caused her parents to agree to the marriage with Grappa, who was so poor. Now another problem presented itself. The bridegroom had no house. His father had sold the hut the family had lived in. Not even in India can a bridegroom bring his bride home on their wedding day to no house. So Grappa decided to build one in a hurry. True, he had no money, but fortunately a good number of stones still remained of Jungali castle, although the best and largest of them had already been pilfered. Scorning to wait for a moonlight night, the would-be bridegroom begged the village headman to lend him his cart. With a long-term policy in view of extracting free labor from Grappa, in return when the harvest came around, the village patel consented. It is safer, if there are no witnesses, when one sets out to commit a felony. Grappa knew this. So he set out alone, after his midday meal, intending to collect the stones, and be back by sundown. Working single-handed is invariably a back-breaking job, as he soon found out. To lever the stones out of the crumbling walls, with the short crowbar he had brought for the purpose, and to carry each stone, and load it onto the bullock cart, took much energy and time, calling for a fair number of resting periods. The sun had dipped behind the hills to the west, and the nightjars were already calling from the sandy track, along which the cart had come, when Grappa decided to call it a day, and bring away the first load. Tomorrow he would borrow somebody else's cart, and fetch a second load. So he beat the bony bulls with a piece of broken bamboo. They started to walk dejectedly homewards. For this strange man, who was not their owner, had not bothered to feed or water them all day. Grappa followed behind leisurely, his mind at peace for the moment. Up to now, there had been nothing to disturb the bridegroom. No sound had he heard to cause him any uneasiness. The waiting tiger that had seen him must have been very hungry indeed, if not on the verge of starvation, to act as he did. Perhaps he was sick or wounded, and had been disabled from hunting his natural prey. Certainly, he was not a regular man-eater, for nobody had been killed in this area by a tiger for quite a time. The bulls hauled the cart past a babul tree, the lower half of which was smothered in lantana. The tiger must have been hiding within that lantana, for that was where he sprang from. When I came to the spot, with a forest range officer, several guards, the sub-inspector of police and a constable just 24 hours later. Some of the stems still bent down by the weight of the animal, as he had lain in wait for Grappa. Probably Grappa had never known what happened, till he found himself being carried away by a tiger. Then he must have struggled, and screamed loudly, for the bulls took fright and bolted, hauling the heavily laden cart behind them. They did not get very far, for there was a curve in the track ahead, where it skirted some lower ground. In turning, the cart went off the track and down the khud, taking the bullocks with it. Miracles often happen, even with bullock carts. While the vehicle was considerably damaged, there was no injury to either bull. Freed from the restraining yoke, they found their way back to Io terrified but unhurt. Long after the sun had set. Adjacent to the village of Io is a forestry department school, where officials already working in the department along with students who have passed the required examination undergo practical instruction in field forestry. A range officer is stationed at the school, along with 2 or 3 senior foresters and a number of guards and watchers, who look after the nurseries and departmental buildings. The headman, alarmed by the fact that his bulls had returned without the cart, assumed that an elephant had attacked and smashed it, and had accounted for Grappa in the process. With half the village trailing behind him, he sought the cooperation of the range officer for permission to send out a search party into the jungle. Permission was readily given, but there was a marked lack of enthusiasm among the villagers to volunteer. Finally 4 or 5 persons were persuaded to offer their services. But by this time, darkness had already fallen. Even in broad daylight, a wild elephant that has killed a man is something no villager will face. In pitch darkness, an encounter of this nature is not to be thought of. So the search was postponed till the next morning. The headman must have spent a sleepless night thinking of his cart, while cursing Grappa for being the cause of his misfortune. Early next day the search party set out. It did not take them long to find the cart at the bottom of the khud, but of Grappa there was no sign. The tracks of the cartwheels and the bullocks, made in the soft sand, showed that the animals had taken the corner at a gallop, hence the accident. What had caused them to do that? Still suspecting that an elephant was to blame, the villagers backtracked and soon found the real cause. The whole story was written in the dry soft sand of the track. There was blood, the pug marks of a tiger, and a distinct drag mark, left by some part of the victim, that had trailed along the ground. Fear fell upon them then. It was dangerous enough to encounter a possible rogue elephant. But they were many in number, and an elephant might be expected to hesitate before attacking such a large party. Not a man-eating tiger. He might reappear at any moment from anywhere, with disastrous results. Without further delay, the group returned to Ior. Grappa was dead beyond doubt. What could be gained by searching for him? By chance, I happened to be camping at Savanipalli that day. This little village lies about 5 miles to the west of Ior. It is a favorite spot of mine, and being just over 50 miles from Bangalore, I often go there at weekends. Incidentally, it marks the scene of the shooting of the only black panther that has ever been known in this region. The details of which adventure have been related in another story. The forest guard of Savanipalli, who had gone to Ior to meet his superior, the range officer, returned at about noon to tell me what had happened to the unfortunate bridegroom Grappa. Carrying a torch and my sweater with a pocketful of dry biscuits and a flask of tea for dinner, in case I was delayed, I set out for Ior within 15 minutes of hearing the news. A report had already been made to the Forest Department headquarters at Denkanikota, a small town 8 miles to the north, by the range officer, so that shortly after my arrival, the sub-inspector of police turned up on his motorcycle with a constable on the pillion seat. Thus, it came about that the 2 police officials, the range officer, a retinue of guards, and myself, came to the lantana thicket at the foot of the babil tree, from which the tiger had sprung, almost 24 hours earlier, upon the unfortunate Grappa as he had walked behind the bullock cart that was laden with stolen stones. The prologue of this story, as I have told, it had already been pieced together by me from scraps of conversation with the 2 officers and their assistants. The sub-inspector of police, who was a Brahmin and a fatalist, remarked more than once on the connection in the web spun by fate between the old British collector, long dead and gone, who had owned Bettamugalam estate and Jungali castle, and the modern bridegroom Grappa, who had no house at all and had been striving to build one. Not quite seeing the point, I quipped that there might also be something in the thought that fate may have taken a dim view of the general situation and decided to punish someone who was in the act of robbing the dead. I meant this as a joke, but was surprised at the manner in which my suggestion caught on. The superstitious Brahmin and the somewhat nervous range officer accepted my point completely. Nobody was keen on looking for what was left of Grappa. As I have said, I found the spot in the lantana where the tiger had been hiding before it sprang upon its victim. The drag mark was still faintly visible, although much of it had been obliterated during the night by the action of the wind upon the sand, grass and leaves, and the movements of ants and other insects. However, we were able to follow for 100 yards or so, when quite unexpectedly, our search ended. An aeroplane tree was growing here, known thus by the local Tamil inhabitants, because it sheds its seeds by a wonderfully clever and novel device. Each seed is situated at the junction of 2 3-inch long leaf-like blades, exactly resembling in miniature the twin propellers of an aeroplane. These blades fall from the parent tree, and are spun and carried by the breeze, along with the seed to incredible distances, before they tumble to the ground. In the shade of this tree, the grass was still green, and protruding from this grass, as if beckoning to us, was a human arm and hand, the 5 fingers spread and pointing upwards. We had found Grappa at last, what was left of him. Peculiarly enough, the upper parts of his body, from breast to head, had been untouched. While one arm stretched upwards, the fingers of the other hand were stuffed into the mouth, as if to stifle a scream. The eye sockets were empty, because the black ants had already eaten away the eyeballs. Then red ants had come, and these now swarmed over the face and skin. In many places the black outer skin had been devoured, exposing patches of white and red flesh, now rotting underneath. The reason why hyenas and jackals had up to now not touched these toothsome portions was simple to guess. Red ants are notorious for their aggressive nature and painful stings. But there was hardly anything left of Grappa's body below his chest. The tiger had eaten his fill, while the scavengers of the night had removed the rest. The foliage of the aeroplane tree had hidden from the vultures what the tiger and the others had left, for had these birds arrived before us, nothing at all would have remained. The stench of death and putrefaction hung heavily in the still evening air. Flies squatted in myriads on the stems of the surrounding grass, prevented from settling on the rotting flesh by the army of red ants that had already driven away their cousins. A terrific battle appeared to have been waged between the two species, as large numbers of dead, of both varieties, strewed the ground for a yard around Grappa's head and arms. Now and again, a sorely wounded member of one of the opposing armies tried to drag itself away. The tiger would certainly not return to eat the little that remained. Why he had left it in the first place was unaccountable. But he would anyway give the red ants a wide berth. The sub-inspector ordered his underling to arrange for the removal of the remains. Then he wrote an unnecessarily verbose statement, which I was asked to sign as a witness. It was getting dark when we returned to the forest rest house at Iowa. The range officer offered me accommodation at his bungalow for the night, but the thought of the dry biscuits in my pocket made me decide to return to my camp at Savanipally and the corned meat that awaited me there. I had my torch, and after all the tiger might not be a confirmed man-eater. So I started out to the dismay of the two officers, who shouted a warning behind me that I might never reach Savanipally. The path wound downhill mostly between lantana scrub and scattered bay-bull saplings till as a lower level was reached, the trees became loftier, and clumps of heavy bamboo grew in among them. The darkness became intense, through which the beam from my torch cut only a narrow pencil of light. Suddenly a feeling of great uneasiness came over me, rather, a feeling of mortal fear. Why, I could not imagine. I had heard no sound, nor had I caught any audible cries of alarm from the deer and other creatures in the jungle, to warn me of danger. Complete silence reigned on every side. There was only the soft crunch of my own rubber-soled boots on the ground, and the occasional crack of a twig or crackle of a leaf as I trod upon it. I halted abruptly and spun around, fully expecting to see the tiger stalking me from behind. But there was nothing to be seen, not even the glimmer of a firefly. There was nothing to be heard, not even the chirping of a friendly cricket. Then I knew why I was so afraid. It was the idea of absolute loneliness. There was no living creature nearby to witness what happened to me. Nothing and nobody to help. And although I could not see him in the gloom, or hear him, even in that absolute silence, I was as certain of the presence of the tiger there, as I was of my own. I have found that at times of great peril in the jungle, the human reflexes act in one of two ways. The trumpeting scream of a charging rogue elephant, or the guttural roar of an attacking tiger or panther, sometimes galvanizes the victim into precipitate flight, or else he is so paralyzed by fear that he is rooted to the spot and quite incapable of movement. It is rare indeed that the victim can think at all, much less think clearly of what he should, or rather could do, in the circumstance. There is no time for thinking. But in this case, there was no screaming elephant before me, nor a roaring tiger for that matter. Only silence, and the certain knowledge that the man-eater was there, and the reflex that came to me was to run. And to run fast as I could, away from that dreadful spot. I had the greatest difficulty in restraining myself, for I knew that if I started to run it would be just what the tiger would like me to do. For then he would attack. All tigers, including man-eaters, know that every other creature is afraid of them. They are accustomed to striking terror into the hearts and minds of their prey. And with that knowledge comes the greater confidence that enables them to hunt so successfully. I knew at that moment that the only thing that could save me from the tiger would be to act otherwise. He was lurking somewhere, watching and waiting for me. Perhaps he was behind, perhaps ahead, or maybe to one side or the other, waiting and watching for an opportunity to spring upon me. He would have done so long before had it not been for my torch, and the bright beam of light that was cutting through the darkness. This had worried him. If I wanted him to attack, all I had to do was extinguish the torch, and start running. Then he would come. I thought quickly. And I kept on walking at a measured pace, flashing the torch behind me, to both sides and then in front. The path was narrow, not more than 6 feet wide at the most. The track turned a corner, and ahead of me the light revealed a rock, standing to the left, and about 100 yards away. It was a sloping rock and appeared to be about 6 to 8 feet high. I felt that I could run up and onto it without difficulty, provided I had a sufficiently long start. For I had had an idea. Here was a suitable place at which to try to tempt the man-eater to show himself. As I turned the idea over in my mind, I continued to walk forward. Those 100 yards were far too long to risk a showdown. The speed of a charging tiger is something fantastic, and has to be seen to be believed. But when the rock was 50 yards away, I decided to take the chance. Making certain my rifle was cocked, and fixing the location of the rock clearly in my mind, I suddenly extinguished the torch, and ran as fast and as hard as I could. The darkness, when the torch went out, was intense. I could not see a thing. That was why I had taken care to face the rock, and fix its location before putting out the torch, and starting to run. It took quite a few seconds, for the tiger to gather his wits and realize that his victim had actually done what he had been waiting for. As I ran, I was just beginning to think that perhaps there was no tiger at all, and that my nerves had made a fool of me. When there was a shattering roar from behind, and the man-eater launched his attack. I heard that roar, but I could run no faster anyway. I was only a few feet ahead of the tiger when I reached the rock and ran up the slope. Then I whirled around, raised the rifle to my shoulder, and pressed the torch switch with my left thumb, all simultaneously. The man-eater had reached the base of the rock, and was crouched for the spring that would carry him to the top when the rifle went off. Almost at point-blank range. With the crash of the explosion, he somersaulted backwards, while I worked the underlever of the .405 to place the second round in the breech. Then I pressed the trigger. Nothing happened. A moment later, with a loud snarl, the tiger leaped to its left, and disappeared into the long grass that grew there. Working the underlever again, I ejected the cartridge that had misfired and fired the next round at the spot where the tiger had just vanished. I had been too frightened when I fired the first shot. But I distinctly remember hearing the echo of the second one, reverberating against the slopes of Gulati Hill, which I could not see in the darkness, but which is within a mile of the rock I stood upon. The growling had ceased, had my second bullet found its mark. Had the tiger collapsed from the effect of my first shot? Perhaps both had taken effect, or had I missed entirely? Worse still, perhaps I had only wounded the brute. With the torch still shining upon the bushes, where the tiger had vanished, I sat down on the rock to collect my scattered wits, and control my breathing. Mostly, to try to think. Only then did I realize how narrow an escape I had had. Had the tiger been closer behind me, or to either side or ahead, he might have cut me off before I could reach the rock. Moreover, had the cartridge that had misfired been one ahead in the magazine of my rifle, it would have failed at the crucial moment, and the man-eater would certainly have completed his spring. When I grew a little calmer, I began to wonder what had happened to the man-eater. It seemed inconceivable that I could have missed him at point-blank range. Then I remembered I had been running fast, and had rushed up the rock at the last moment. Fear, excitement and exertion had made me breathe hard, and this had evidently caused me to press the trigger unconsciously, causing me to miss entirely, or perhaps just round the beast. It was impossible for me to follow up in that darkness. If I had missed him, he would have been scared away entirely. If he was wounded, it was very unlikely that the man-eater would resume the pursuit if I continued on my way to Savanipalli. So after a few moments, I decided to do that and return the next morning to take up the trail. I reached Savanipalli without event, and lay down in my little tent, still thinking of what should be done the next day. Then the dried biscuits in my pocket reminded me that I was hungry, and I got up to make tea and open the tin of meat that had been the cause of the whole incident. There were no Pujaris or Aboriginal trackers at Sarvanipalli, but there was Sher Khan, a character who had led a colorful existence, and must at the time have been about 40 years old. He was a Muslim, a poacher of game, a timber thief, and the suspected author of several dacoities, on a minor scale, when bullock carts carrying sacks of grain to the villages of Denkanikota and Ancheti had been held up and robbed at night. The method of dacoity had been as simple as it had been effective. The carts used to travel by night in order to save time. Generally, half a dozen of them would move, one behind the other, for company and for protection from wild animals, particularly elephants, and of course the evil spirits, that are said to be everywhere. Highway robbery, up to that time, was unheard of. The first case reported to the police was by 5 cart men, who had been behind one another, from Ancheti to Denkanikota. They were on the Ghat road, when it had happened, 9 miles from the destination. The time was 1 a.m., and the bulls strained at their loads, on the steep gradient. Each driver sat in his cart, more than half asleep. Suddenly a voice hailed them, from the darkness of the roadside. It was harsh and loud. They saw no man, but the voice said that a gang of dacoits was hiding by the wayside. They had loaded muskets, and all would be well if they followed orders. Then followed the orders. They were very simple. Get down from your carts. All 5 of you. And walk back for a full mile. When you reach the 10th milestone, you may sit dawn. Light a fire and wait there till morning. When daylight comes, you may return to your carts. Remember, some of us will follow and keep a watch over you till dawn. If any one of you dares to disobey, he will be shot without further warning. Remember also that, we promise we shall not harm your carts or animals. You are poor men and we do not want to hurt you. It is the rich men's belongings, carried in your carts, that we want. The cart men obeyed. They were thankful that they had been spared. Early next morning, they found their carts, standing where they had been left. Some of the foodstuff had been stolen, but not all of it. Only the more valuable items. The gang could not have been a very large one after all, or they would have taken everything. This happened 2 or 3 times more, on other roads and tracks leading to Denkanikota and Ancheti, before the carts stopped moving, at night and police patrols took their place. Several suspects were rounded up, including Sher Khan. They were beaten and locked up. But, all of them always affirmed complete innocence and all of them had alibis. That was how I first met Sher Khan. He was returning to Sarvanipalli, after one such beating and complained aloud, of the injustice that was rampant in this world. But there was a mischievous twinkle, of insincerity in his eye as he spoke. As I said, he was a Muslim and the literal translation of his name is, Chief Among Tigers. He was a ruffian, but a very likable one, and that is how he became my friend. I would never fail, when at Sarvanipalli, to visit his little house, and drink tea with him, and he would never fail to return my call. So I went to Sher Khan early, in the morning after my adventure, and asked him to assist me. For I was confident that I had not missed the tiger, when I had fired at point-blank range. I knew I must have hit it. That meant following up a wounded tiger in the jungle, and to do that there must be 2 persons. Following a blood trail through bushes, over leaves and on hard and stony ground, requires concentration of eyesight and mind. One must look here, there and everywhere, for a speck of blood or a mere smear, of the underside of a leaf or against a stem or rock. While you are engaged in so looking, the wounded tiger might be just ahead, waiting for you, or he may be lying to the right or the left, concealed behind a tuft of grass, a clump of bamboo, a tree trunk or a termite hill. Waiting till you come within springing distance. There is a third possibility, and that is he may be stalking you from behind, even while you are looking for him. But you are blissfully unaware of his presence, because your attention is concentrated on the ground, following his trail. On the other hand, if you try to keep an effective lookout for the wounded beast, you will soon find you have lost the trail. You just cannot do both jobs effectively, and so a second person is essential. One of you concentrates on following the tiger's blood spoor and tracks, while the other keeps a sharp lookout ahead, to the right, left and also behind. in the hands of this second person, lies not only his own life, but the life of his companion. Sher Khan volunteered to help without hesitation, but insisted that I drink the customary cup of tea with him before we set out. A clap of his hands, and one of his 4 wives responded. He told her to make
एक चाय first class for Sahib.
Being a Muslim, he was allowed to have 4 legal wives, and he had them. Most of us find it a problem to manage one, but he managed all 4 with ease. And this is how he did it. Sher Khan showed no preference towards any one of his 4 spouses, either to the youngest or the most recent or the prettiest. They were all kept strictly kosher, that is to say they were compelled to cover their faces with a veil when they went out in public. No man was allowed to look upon them. I, as a very particular friend, had the privilege of seeing their faces, and even of speaking to them. But very sparingly, mind you, when I visited his house. Sher Khan made it a practice to divide the household duties among his 4 wives on a weekly roster basis. For a week, one of them would be responsible for the cooking of all the food, with a second to assist her. The third would be responsible for washing all the utensils. The fourth, for the household work such as sweeping, mending, washing of clothes, etc. The following week, the roster would change, and so on week by week, thereby dividing all the work very equitably among all 4. Sher Khan himself would not lift a finger to do any household work. He did the marketing, if his rather nefarious activities could be so described, and brought home the earning, or the money, whichever you might prefer to call it. The wife who did the hardest work for that particular week, namely the cook, he would sleep with 2 days in the week, the remaining 3 women 1 day each. Fridays and Sundays were off days from that sort of thing. Days of rest, as he called them. They were a poor family, but disciplined, happy and contented. The women never quarreled with him, and hardly ever among themselves. For if they did, a beating would be administered, fairly, equitably and impartially. Each recalcitrant wife, receiving an equal number of blows or cuffs, according to the nature of the offense. And in spite of the often undeniably pressing demands made upon him, he had no children. As soon as we had drunk our tea, we were off. Sher Khan announced that he had no gun and brought a rusty sword with him instead. He remarked that it had belonged to his father, and to his father's father's father, who was a soldier, serving under the great Tipu Sultan, the Tiger of Mysore. The mathematics involved in the problem of checking whether this man's great-great-grandfather could have lived in Tipu's lifetime are rather too involved for me. In the meanwhile, we had walked out of earshot of all his wives, and I raised an impersonal question, addressed perhaps to the air. A voice comes out of the darkness and threatens to shoot many cart men. Yet there is no gun. How can that be, Sher Khan? The silence for a moment is complete. Then he replied, "You may call me a liar if you wish, Sahib. But that is exactly what happened. There was no gun at that time, nor any other. I never possessed one and still do not have a gun. And the gang consisted of myself, and 3 of the wives, Sahib. The 4th is too old. But she had the brains, and it was all her idea. And I believed him. We were nearly at our destination. There stood the sloping rock, from which I had fired at the man-eater the previous night. This time it was to my right. We approached in silence, and looked at the ground. No blood was to be seen, and the earth was too dry and hard for tracks. Without speaking, I pointed to the bushes bordering the path, where the tiger disappeared from view. I took the lead for the moment, with my Muslim friend directly behind. In spite of the prevailing dryness all around, it was evident that a heavy body had recently passed through. A couple of broken stems hung loosely, still joined to their parent branch by the outer skins. A yard or 2 further and we saw it almost simultaneously. Blood. There was a splash of bright red, on the carpet of dry brown leaves, that covered the ground. I touched it with my forefinger, and rubbed it against my thumb. It was thick and coagulated, and by that, I knew that my bullet of the night before had inflicted more than a mere surface wound. It had penetrated deeply. We changed places now, and I put Sher Khan ahead of me. He would concentrate all his attention on following the blood trail, while I would cover him, and myself in all 4 directions. The Muslim was no born tracker, but what he lacked in ability as an aborigine, he made up for in intelligence. He fussed and fumbled around, taking far more time than would a member of any of the jungle tribes in following such a trail, but he found one blood spot after another. The tiger had bled far more freely now. The exertions caused by his wounds had no doubt opened the wound. Splashes and pools of blood lay all along the trail, making it easy to follow. I caught sight of a slight movement ahead, and lightly touched Sher Khan with my hand. He halted at the prearranged signal and froze. With rifle to shoulder, I watched the spot from whence the movement came. I also watched on both sides and even glanced behind us. 4 wounded tigers are notoriously clever in lying in ambush, or in creeping upon their enemies from behind. The movement came again. A small branch swayed ominously a few feet ahead of us. I prepared for the attack. Stretching out my hand, I gripped Sher Khan by the shoulder, and pulled him unceremoniously behind me. The branch swayed again. I stared at it for a minute. And then I relaxed. A false alarm. I noticed the leaves on the swaying branch were all upside down. That is because it had been broken by an elephant and was hanging suspended to the place from which it was broken by the stems of some creepers that were strong enough to bear its weight. There must be no talking whatever in a situation like the present. So I reached backwards, gripped Sher Khan, and once again placed him in the lead. Then I nodded my head as a signal for him to press on. We proceeded slowly, and passed the suspended branch. Under a bush, we noticed that the dried grass had been dyed deeply with blood. It seemed to be all over the place, on the leaves and stems of the bush as well. The tiger must have lain down here. Perhaps he rolled on the ground. Perhaps he covered his injured face with his paws and got them all covered with gore too. That would account for the blood spread so widely under the bush before us. I touched Sher Khan again to halt him, and we listened for a full 5 minutes. But we heard not a sound. As carefully and silently as we were moving, the 2 of us would necessarily have made some noise in the undergrowth over that dry terrain. If the tiger was nearby, he must surely have heard us. Then he would either growl in warning, attack, or slink away silently. But nothing of the kind happened. The blood trail now unexpectedly veered to the left, and we knew that the tiger was making for a small stream that skirted the foothills. The wound must have been taking effect, and thirst had driven him there for water. At that time of the year, the stream was dry except for a few isolated pools here and there. The tiger was making for one of these pools, and the chances were that when he reached it he would lie up in the vicinity till he recovered from his wound or died of it, a lingering, starving, horrible death. I hate wounding an animal, and spare no pains, when I have done so, to follow it up and put it out of its misery. From the amount and nature of the blood lost by the tiger, it looked as if my bullet had inflicted a severe wound, from which there was little chance of recovery. Once more, I thought of the dreadful lingering death that was in store for this animal, unless I succeeded in finding it. I stopped Sher Khan, and we conferred in whispers for a few minutes. I knew of a pool on the riverbed, which I judged to be at least 2 miles away, but Sher Khan said there was a closer one, smaller but which held water throughout the year, higher up the stream and less than a mile from where we now stood. So we continued to follow the blood trail, and as the Muslim friend predicted, after a short distance it veered to the left, and made for the smaller pool, now directly ahead. The ground sloped as we approached the streambed, and I was made aware of its nearness by the repeated cries of jungle fowl that sheltered in the thick belt of trees and undergrowth that lined both banks, sustained in summertime by the water that was hidden from sight but still flowed beneath the dry sand. In a few minutes, the short dry grass, withered by the sun, was replaced by long green stems. The heat and sight of the sun was shut out by a canopy of trees, and I knew we had reached the rivulet. The blood trail went straight ahead. We were in sight of the dry sands of the streambed, stretching to right and left. I can imagine the agony of the wounded beast that came here last night or in the early hours of this morning, in search of water to allay its burning thirst, only to be confronted by this waterless stretch. But Sher Khan whispered that the pool was just around the corner to our left, now a stone's throw away, and unerringly the trail led in that direction. Once again, I changed places with my friend, and took the lead. Tracking was unnecessary now, as clearly the wounded tiger was making for the pool, and I felt we would find it there. We turned a corner but I could see no pool. I stopped in silent perplexity, when Sher came up from behind to point to an outcrop of flat rock, which could just be seen above the sand of the stream and within a few feet of the further bank. A plover rose into the air, from the rock, crying. And I knew that water lay hidden from my view, in a hollow of that rock. The stream had narrowed there, and both banks had come very close to each other. The undergrowth was dense, and the forest loomed menacingly around and above us, from the ground that dipped down to the bed of the rivulet. We halted again. There was silence and no indication of the tiger's presence. I looked down and could see no blood trail. Evidently, it did not approach across the sandy bed, but kept to the cover of the undergrowth bordering the banks. Forward we went once more. We were there at last, and what a sad story revealed itself in the water of the tiny pool, and the sloping rock that led down to it. For the water was red with blood, and the rock was sticky with it, where the tiger had evidently lain in agony, with his head in the water to assuage his thirst, and to lessen the pain of his wound. His pug marks were visible on the rock in several places, steeped in his own blood. Finally, he had gone to the shelter of the bank, and I knew that was where I would find him. Laying in the cool of the undergrowth like all stricken animals, he would await his end with patience. Then I remembered that this animal had been responsible for killing a human being, as far as could be made out for no apparent reason. If not brought to book, he would no doubt in time have become a confirmed man-eater. Motioning to Sher to stay where he was, I advanced to meet him and finish him off. I heard a slight sound behind me and looked around. Sher was following. Perhaps he wanted to be present to witness the last scene in this drama. Perhaps he was just nervous at being left alone. We advanced into the dense undergrowth beneath the canopy of trees and were lost to sight. The silence that had reigned all this while was then broken by a shattering roar, that seemed to come from the very ground at my feet, and things began to happen very fast. Momentarily, the undergrowth was agitated violently, and then a mighty form launched itself past, and almost over me onto Sher who was not 2 feet behind. The Muslim yelled, and swiped wildly his rusty sword. The blunt edge met the bulk of the springing tiger, and the impetus of both objects caused the blade to bite into the flank of the animal. Sher went down, still screaming, and the tiger fell on top him. Fortunately, Sher had the presence of mind to cover his head and face with his 2 arms, as the tiger sought to bite him. Leaning forward, I placed the rifle behind its neck, ensuring the bullet would not endanger my friend, and pressed the trigger. I fired once again, while Sher scrambled to his feet, and leaped out of range of the dying creature's claws. Then the drama was over. Strangely enough, my friend was practically unhurt, except for a few scratches, and the reason was that my bullet of the night before had gone into his upper palate, and come out above his nose. The whole frontal or nasal bone hung loosely by the flesh. A truly ghastly wound from which the poor beast could never have recovered. It was fortunate that the blow my friend aimed at the tiger with his ancestor's rusty sword had met its mark, for I was directly in line with it. Had he missed, Tipu, the tiger of Mysore and his henchman of long ago, Sher ancestor would have claimed one more victim. I would have been decapitated by the force of that blow. Sher laughed afterwards, when I told him this. He said I had my own revenge when my bullet, fired into the tiger's neck, had passed but a few inches above his head. He asked me if he might have the skin of the animal, as a memento of our encounter, and I gladly gave it to him. For despite his many faults and his rascality, Sher is a brave man and a most likable fellow. Above all, I admire the way in which he manages his 4 wives. Long may they be spared to him and he to them. We sat by the campfire, before I left him, and swapped yarns. He told me some of his adventures, while I smoked my pipe and listened. Beyond the leaves all was lost, in the darkness of the jungle night. Now and again a burst of sparks soared skywards, as one of us threw a fresh log onto the fire to keep it brightly burning. From behind his hut came suddenly the jungle chorus of the jackal pack. After that there was an abrupt hush. A heavy, all-pervading silence. You can hear it, you feel it, you know it. It is the silence that heralds the unexpected. As complete as if a switch had been turned. Then, far away across the hill the second came rolling down to us, permeating the jungle and riding across the tops of the trees, in the valley below.
The end.